The Vampire King had been pretending to be comatose for 3 months, waiting for the perfect moment to escape. Until the night nurse started telling him about her failed relationships and broken heart. What was supposed to be a simple hospital infiltration became an obsession he couldn't fake his way out of. Elena Santos clipped her badge to her scrubs and pushed through the ICU doors, the familiar weight of another night shift settling on her shoulders like a well-worn coat. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song above polished floors that reflected her sneakers as she moved between the beds, checking charts and adjusting IVs with practiced efficiency. Room after room held the same choreography of beeping monitors and steady breathing, but when she reached bed 7, her steps always slowed. John Doe lay motionless as he had for 3 months, his dark hair perfectly arranged against the white pillow, skin that should have been pale and waxen instead maintaining an almost luminous quality that defied medical explanation. His vitals displayed numbers that made no sense, heart rate too steady, blood pressure too perfect, oxygen saturation that never wavered from 100%. Elena pulled up a chair beside his bed and reached for his IV line, her fingers brushing against his wrist as she checked the insertion site. The skin felt warm, not the cool temperature she expected from someone in his condition, and she found herself lingering longer than necessary. "You know, I had the strangest dream last night," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "I was dancing in this beautiful ballroom with someone I couldn't quite see, but I felt safe, completely safe for the first time in years." She adjusted his blanket with careful hands, noting how his chest rose and fell in a rhythm too controlled to be unconscious. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Marcus thinks I spend too much time talking to patients who can't hear me, but I think you can somehow. I think you listen better than anyone who's ever been in my life. Behind closed eyelids, Adrian Blackthorne absorbed every word with an intensity that surprised him, his supernatural senses cataloging the slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned safety, the way her pulse quickened when she spoke of loneliness. For 847 years, he had moved through the world as apex predator, taking what he needed without thought for the mortals who served as nothing more than sustenance or obstacles. 3 months ago, he had infiltrated this hospital with a singular purpose: to steal a rare enzyme from the research laboratory that might synthesize a cure for the curse his brother Victor had placed upon his bloodline, a curse that reduced his powers to near-mortal weakness during daylight hours. The plan was simple: pose as a comatose patient, heal from supposed injuries during the day when his powers were diminished, then strike at night when darkness returned some measure of his strength. But Elena had complicated everything with her nightly confessions, her gentle touches, her belief that somewhere beneath his still exterior lived a man worth saving. He catalogued every detail about her: the scent of vanilla from her shampoo, the way she unconsciously hummed while working, how her breathing synchronized with his when she leaned close enough to check his pupils. Tonight she spoke of a failed relationship that had shattered her trust, how Dr. Marcus Holt had promised her forever, then chosen his career ambitions over their engagement. "I keep thinking maybe I'm not meant for love," she whispered, and Adrian felt something foreign stir in his chest, an ache that had nothing to do with Victor's curse. "You probably think I'm foolish, talking to someone who can't answer back, but somehow this feels more honest than any conversation I've had with someone awake." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and Adrian caught the faint scent of jasmine from her wrist, a detail his enhanced senses absorbed like a man dying of thirst. The hours passed in comfortable silence as Elena moved through her rounds, but she always returned to his bedside, sometimes bringing her tablet to catch up on charting, sometimes simply sitting in the darkness listening to the rhythm of his machines. As dawn approached, Adrian felt the familiar weakness creeping through his limbs, his supernatural strength ebbing with the rising sun, until he truly became as helpless as he appeared. But for the first time in centuries, Vulnerability didn't feel like defeat when Elena's voice was the last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him. The next evening brought storm clouds and the sharp ozone scent of approaching rain, and with it came Dr. Marcus Holt's perfectly pressed lab coat and demanding stride. Elena was adjusting John Doe's position to prevent bed sores when Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of professional concern and personal irritation that she recognized all too well. "We need to talk," he said, and the edge in his voice made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. She followed him to the nurse's station, where the overnight skeleton crew pretended not to listen while Marcus launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about appropriate patient interaction and professional boundaries. "You're spending an unusual amount of time with the John Doe in 7, he said, his words clipped with barely contained frustration. "I've reviewed the charts and there's no medical justification for the extended periods you're logged in his room." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "I'm providing thorough patient care, which includes neurological stimulation for comatose patients. It's an accepted practice for potentially promoting consciousness recovery." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice to the intimate tone that once made her heart race, but now only made her want to step away. "Elena, this isn't about medical protocol, and we both know it. You've been different since he arrived, distracted, spending your breaks in his room instead of with the staff." She crossed her arms and met his gaze directly. "My patient care has never been criticized before, and I won't start accepting criticism now just because you've decided to pay attention to my work schedule 3 months after we ended our engagement." The words hung between them like drawn swords, and Marcus's jaw tightened with the particular frustration of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Look at his chart, Elena. Really look at it. His recovery rate is impossible, his vitals are too perfect, his physical condition hasn't deteriorated at all in 3 months. None of it makes medical sense." There was something in his voice beyond professional skepticism, something that sounded almost like fear, but Elena dismissed it as jealousy taking an absurd form. "You're suggesting I'm compromising my professional judgment because I provide appropriate care to a patient who happens to be physically attractive. That says more about your mindset than mine." Marcus leaned against the counter, his expression shifting to something she recognized as his persuasive mode, the one he used with difficult patients and hospital administrators. "I'm saying that sometimes we see what we want to see, especially when we're lonely. Come back to me, Elena. We were good together before I made that mistake. You don't have to settle for one-sided conversations with someone who will never wake up." The presumption in his words ignited anger she had been holding back for months. "I would rather have honest silence than dishonest promises, Marcus. And my patient will wake up. I believe that completely." She turned away before he could respond, walking back toward room 7 with her heart pounding from confrontation and something deeper she couldn't name. Hours later, when the hospital had settled into its deepest quiet, Elena returned to Adrian's bedside with a paperback novel and a cup of coffee that had gone cold during her earlier rounds. She opened the book to a passage she had marked earlier, a scene where the heroine described her perfect relationship to a friend. "Someone who listens without trying to fix everything," she read aloud. "Someone who makes me feel safe enough to be completely honest, even about the ugly parts of myself. Someone who protects without controlling, who loves the person I actually am instead of the person they think I could become." She glanced up at Adrian's face, searching for any sign of consciousness in features that seemed carved from marble. "I used to think that was impossible, that kind of love. But sitting here with you, I almost believe it exists." What Adrian heard in her words was not just longing, but a blueprint for devotion he had never considered, a love based on acceptance rather than possession. His enhanced hearing caught the slight acceleration of her heartbeat as she spoke, the unconscious way she leaned toward his bed when describing trust and protection. Through his closed eyelids, he sensed her moving closer, her warmth radiating against his supposedly insensitive skin. The vanilla scent of her shampoo mixed with the faint jasmine from her wrist creating a combination that bypassed 8 centuries of predatory instincts and struck something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to human longing. Elena closed the book and settled back in her chair, but she didn't release his hand from where she had unconsciously taken it while reading. I know this sounds crazy, but sometimes I feel like you can hear me. Like you're choosing to listen even though you can't respond. Her thumb traced small circles against his knuckles, and Adrian fought to keep his supernatural reflexes from responding to her touch. The effort sent a surge of energy through his nervous system that he couldn't quite contain, and somewhere in the wall behind his bed, electrical circuits sparked in response. The monitors beside him flickered briefly, displaying impossible readings for half a second before returning to their steady rhythm. Elena attributed the glitch to the approaching storm, but she didn't move her hand from his, and Adrian realized with crystalline clarity that his mission to steal laboratory enzymes had become secondary to an infinitely more dangerous objective: learning everything about the woman who spoke to his darkness, as if it were light. Elena arrived for her shift with the hyper-aware alertness of someone who had spent the previous day unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully ordered world. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving the hospital corridors eerily quiet, except for the eternal hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whisper of ventilation systems. She moved through her initial rounds with mechanical precision, but her steps quickened as she approached room 7, driven by an urgency she couldn't name. The moment she stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. Adrian lay in exactly the same position as always, arms at his sides, head centered on the pillow, but something was wrong in a way that made her skin prickle with unease. His hair, which she had carefully arranged before leaving the previous morning, now fell slightly differently across his forehead, and his right hand rested a fraction of an inch further from his body than she remembered. The changes were minute, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't spent countless hours memorizing every detail of his appearance, but to Elena they screamed of intrusion and violation. She moved to his bedside with trembling fingers, checking his chart for any notation of medical procedures or visitor logs that might explain the disturbance. Nothing. The overnight nurse had documented routine vital checks and medication administration, but no mention of repositioning or physical therapy. Elena's nursing instincts, honed by years of reading subtle changes in patient condition, told her someone had been in this room, someone who had touched her patient without authorization or documentation. The violation felt intensely personal, as if someone had invaded not just Adrian's space, but her private sanctuary of whispered confessions and gentle care. She immediately called security, requesting footage from the hallway cameras, and spent the next hour reviewing digital recordings that showed nothing more unusual than the standard parade of medical personnel moving through their routines. Yet the evidence of her eyes and her instincts told a different story, one that made her stomach clench with protective fury, and something deeper she refused to examine. From that night forward, Elena abandoned any pretense of normal work routine and positioned herself as Adrian's guardian, taking her charting to his bedside and conducting her other patient checks with swift efficiency that left maximum time for watching over room 7. She told herself it was professional duty, that any patient deserved protection from unauthorized intrusion, but the truth hummed beneath her conscious awareness like a tuning fork struck against bone. What Elena could not know was that behind his closed eyelids, Adrian was experiencing a revelation that terrified him more than 8 centuries of supernatural conflicts and political machinations ever had. Her emotional confessions, particularly when they touched on pain or loss, were triggering involuntary responses his weakened but still supernatural nervous system could not fully suppress. When she spoke of her father's death on a rain-soaked highway 3 years earlier, when her voice broke describing how she never got to say goodbye, Adrian's hand had clenched involuntarily against the hospital sheets. When she laughed while recounting a childhood memory of dancing on her mother's feet in the kitchen, his lips had curved in an almost smile that lasted less than a second, but felt like a crack in a dam holding back centuries of enforced emotional detachment. The realization that he was responding to her feelings, that his supernatural physiology was somehow attuning to her emotional state despite Victor's curse, filled him with a mixture of exhilaration and terror that threatened to shatter his carefully maintained facade. He began to understand that Elena was not just a pleasant distraction from his mission, but a catalyst transforming something fundamental in his nature, something that made the stolen enzyme samples seem irrelevant compared to the ache of longing that built in his chest every time she spoke his assumed name with such tender concern. The third night of Elena's vigil brought an unexpected visitor who moved through the ICU with the unremarkable efficiency of hospital maintenance staff. The janitor appeared ordinary in every way, medium height and build, wearing the standard gray uniform and wheeling a cart filled with cleaning supplies, but Adrian's supernatural senses recognized the familiar energy signature immediately. Victor had found him, and worse, had somehow infiltrated the hospital under a mundane disguise that would allow him access to every room and corridor without suspicion. Adrian lay paralyzed by his own deception as his brother approached the bed, ostensibly to empty the wastebasket while Elena was occupied with a patient emergency down the hall. Victor leaned close enough that his whispered words would be audible only to supernatural hearing, his voice carrying the cold amusement of a predator who had cornered prey. So this is where the mighty vampire king has been hiding, playing house with a mortal nurse who thinks she can heal the world with gentle touches and bedtime stories. Victor's fingers drummed against the bed rail in a rhythm that Adrian recognized as an old threat signal from their shared centuries of rivalry. How touching that you found yourself a pet, brother. I wonder what she would think if she knew the monster she's been confessing her deepest secrets to. How quickly her tender feelings would turn to terror if she saw what you really are. The janitor's cart rattled softly as Victor moved it closer, using the motion to mask his continued monologue. The throne grows cold in your absence, Adrian. The council whispers of new leadership, and I find myself surprisingly willing to answer their call. But first, I think I'll play with your new toy. See what makes her so special that the legendary vampire king would abandon his duty for bedside vigil. Adrian's supernatural control wavered as protective rage flooded through him, his vital signs spiking just enough to trigger a soft alarm that brought Elena hurrying back to his room. Victor melted away with his cleaning cart as Elena rushed to check Adrian's monitors, her gentle hands smoothing his hair and adjusting his blankets while she murmured reassurances about everything being fine. The irony of her comforting him while his brother planned her destruction would have been laughable if it hadn't filled Adrian with a fury that made the overhead lights flicker ominously. Elena attributed the electrical disturbance to aging hospital infrastructure, but Adrian knew his control was slipping in ways that could expose not just his deception, but the supernatural world itself. The next night, Elena brought a photograph from home, a picture of her father that she propped on Adrian's bedside table, while recounting memories of his kindness and wisdom, how he had taught her to see the humanity in everyone regardless of their circumstances. She spoke of loneliness that had consumed her since his death, how she feared becoming one of those people who lived entirely for work, because they had no one waiting at home. Without conscious thought, she reached for Adrian's hand as her voice broke with the admission that sometimes she talked to him because she was desperate to believe someone, somewhere, was listening to her pain. The moment her skin touched his, Adrian's supernatural senses exploded with awareness that transcended his physical limitations. Her pulse thrummed through her fingertips like a living thing, carrying not just the rhythm of her heartbeat, but the emotional resonance of her feelings, her loneliness, and hope and growing affection flowing into him like transfusion. Her unique scent, vanilla and jasmine, and something indefinably her, filled his consciousness with an intensity that bypassed 8 centuries of predatory instincts and struck something deeper, something that recognized her as more than prey or ally or even beloved. She was becoming essential in ways that violated every survival instinct he possessed, and the recognition should have terrified him into immediate flight. Instead, The connection triggered something unprecedented in his supernatural experience, a shared consciousness that pulled Elena into a dreamscape neither of them consciously created. She found herself in an elegant ballroom lit by crystal chandeliers, wearing a gown that felt like liquid moonlight against her skin. Music swirled around her in waltz time, and strong arms guided her across marble floors in perfect rhythm. The man who held her remained just outside clear focus, dark-haired and elegant, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw silver depths that held centuries of longing and recognition that felt like coming home. Adrian experienced the same vision, but from the opposite perspective, seeing himself through Elena's idealized romantic lens as someone worthy of love rather than fear, someone whose touch brought safety instead of destruction. The shared dream felt more real than waking consciousness, more true than any interaction he had experienced in 8 centuries of existence. And for those suspended moments, he understood what poets meant when they wrote of souls recognizing their other half. The vision shattered when alarms began blaring from room 3, another patient coding, and Elena jerked back to consciousness with her hands still wrapped around Adrian's fingers. She stared at their joined hands in confusion, memory of the ballroom dream vivid as physical experience, before professional training kicked in and she rushed to assist with the medical emergency. Adrian lay in the aftermath, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of reality itself, his supernatural senses still resonating with the echo of her touch and the impossible intimacy of shared consciousness. Dr. Marcus Holt appeared in the doorway just as Elena returned from the successful resuscitation, his expression hardening when he saw her again positioned beside the John Doe patient's bed. "Elena, we need to discuss your patient assignments. I think it would be beneficial if you rotated to different areas of the ICU, perhaps the cardiac wing where your skills would be better utilized." His tone carried administrative authority, but Elena heard the personal jealousy beneath professional concern and felt her protective instincts flare with unprecedented intensity. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my current patient load, Marcus. There's no medical justification for changing my assignments, especially when my patients are showing positive responses to consistent care." Marcus stepped into the room, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller and more threatening. "Elena, you're emotionally compromised. I found you holding his hand, which violates professional boundaries and could expose the hospital to liability issues. I'm going to have to document this incident and recommend you be reassigned immediately." The threat in his words triggered something primal in Adrian's supernatural consciousness, a protective rage that surged through his nervous system like lightning through a conductor. The monitors around his bed erupted in a cacophony of alarms as his vital signs spiked to impossible levels, heart rate climbing beyond human survival parameters while his blood pressure readings swung wildly between extremes. Elena rushed to his side, her medical training taking precedence over the argument as she checked his airway and pulse, murmuring reassurances while his body convulsed with what appeared to be seizure activity. Marcus backed away as medical equipment throughout the room began to malfunction, screens flickering and alarms blaring in electronic chaos that brought the crash team running. In the midst of the medical crisis, Adrian fought to regain control of his supernatural responses, forcing his vital signs back toward normal ranges while Elena's gentle hands guided him toward stability. She assumed his dramatic response was stress-related, perhaps triggered by the raised voices and emotional tension in his room, not realizing that her vampire king had been moments away from revealing his true nature to protect her from a perceived threat. As the chaos settled and the medical team dispersed, Elena remained at Adrian's bedside, with her hand resting protectively on his arm, her touch sending waves of calm through his supernatural senses, while she whispered apologies for the disturbance. Marcus retreated with promises to file incident reports and request administrative review. But his threats felt distant and manageable compared to the growing certainty that Elena was becoming something far more dangerous to Adrian's carefully constructed world than any ancient curse or political rival. Elena's nursing shift ended at 7 in the morning, But instead of heading home to her empty apartment, she found herself in the hospital's medical library with a stack of textbooks and research journals spread across a corner table like evidence in a criminal investigation. Adrian's latest blood work results lay beside her laptop, the numbers and chemical compositions reading like a foreign language that challenged everything she understood about human physiology. His hemoglobin levels remained impossibly stable despite 3 months of intravenous nutrition. His white blood cell count showed patterns that suggested an immune system functioning at superhuman efficiency. And most disturbing of all, his cellular regeneration markers indicated tissue repair happening at rates that defied biological explanation. Elena cross-referenced the anomalies with every medical condition she could think of, from rare genetic disorders to experimental drug trials, but nothing in contemporary medicine could account for what she was seeing. She expanded her search into historical medical literature, diving deep into archived case studies and obscure research papers that most medical professionals would dismiss as outdated curiosities. What she found made her skin crawl with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. Case after case of similar patients appeared in medical records dating back over 2 centuries, always young men with extraordinary preservation during comatose states, always arriving at hospitals with no identification or family, always associated with subsequent unexplained disappearances of medical staff who had shown particular interest in their cases. The patterns were subtle enough to avoid official notice, scattered across different countries and medical institutions, but when viewed together, they painted a picture that challenged Elena's rational worldview in ways that made her question her own sanity. Each historical case included detailed notes about unusual blood chemistry, impossible healing rates, and most unsettling of all, reports from nursing staff about feeling inexplicably drawn to provide extended care for patients who showed no signs of improvement or consciousness. Elena traced the timeline of disappearances, noting how they clustered around the mysterious patients like iron filings drawn to a magnet, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. She printed everything she could find and stuffed the papers into a folder that felt like it contained secrets too dangerous to possess, then spent the drive home trying to convince herself that correlation didn't equal causation and that her growing obsession with John Doe was clouding her professional judgment. The next evening brought Sarah Chen's concerned intervention as Elena prepared for another shift with the intense focus of a soldier heading into battle. Sarah had been her friend and colleague for 3 years, long enough to recognize when Elena's protective instincts were overriding her common sense, and she cornered Elena in the break room with the blunt honesty that had made her an excellent nurse and loyal friend. "You're losing yourself in room 7, she said without preamble, settling into the plastic chair across from Elena with the determined expression of someone prepared for a difficult conversation. "I've watched you obsess over patients before, especially the ones who remind you of your father, but this is different and we both know it." Elena tried to deflect with professional explanations about challenging cases and the importance of consistent patient care, but Sarah's knowing look cut through every excuse like a scalpel through tissue. "He's been comatose for 3 months, Elena. His prognosis hasn't changed, his family situation hasn't changed, and according to every medical expert who's examined him, he's never going to wake up. You're investing emotional energy in someone who can't reciprocate, and it's starting to affect your judgment with other patients." The accusation stung because it carried just enough truth to be painful, but Elena found herself defending Adrian with a passion that surprised them both. "There's something different about him, Sarah. I know how that sounds, but his responses aren't typical for someone in his condition. His vital signs react to external stimuli in ways that suggest conscious awareness, and his physical preservation is medically impossible without some kind of intervention we're not seeing." Sarah's expression softened with the particular sympathy reserved for friends who were clearly struggling with reality. "Elena, honey, you're seeing what you want to see because you're lonely and he's safe to care about. He can't hurt you the way Marcus did because he can't make choices or promises or decisions that might disappoint you. But that's not love, that's projection, and it's not fair to either of you. The conversation continued in circles until their shift began, but Elena carried Sarah's words with her as she moved through her rounds, hyper-aware of how her colleagues watched her interactions with Room 7. She tried to maintain professional distance, completing Adrian's care with efficient detachment, but found herself lingering despite her best intentions. Tonight, she brought her research folder and spread the historical case studies across his bedside table, speaking aloud about the patterns she had discovered and her growing certainty that his condition was connected to something beyond conventional medicine. "I know you can hear me," she whispered, watching his face for any flicker of response. "These cases going back centuries, they all involve people like you, and they all end with questions no one wants to answer. I don't care what's medically impossible anymore. I care about what's actually happening, and what's happening is that you're aware and you're choosing to trust me with that awareness." What Elena could not see was Adrian's internal struggle as her words penetrated his consciousness like arrows finding their mark. Her research had brought her dangerously close to truths that could destroy both their lives, and her faith in his awareness filled him with guilt that felt like acid in his veins. She saw him more clearly than she knew, but her clarity was based on caring rather than fear, on hope rather than the survival instincts that should have warned her away from a predator who had spent centuries perfecting the art of deception. Her trust felt like a gift he had never deserved and could never repay. And for the first time in his existence, Adrian began to understand why humans spoke of love as both salvation and damnation. He began leaving subtle signs of his consciousness, small acknowledgments that could be explained as coincidence or wishful thinking, but that he hoped would reassure her that her instincts were correct. When she positioned his hand in a certain way, he maintained that exact placement through shift changes and medical procedures. When she spoke directly to his face, he held eye contact a fraction of a second longer than unconscious patients typically managed, just enough to suggest awareness without triggering medical intervention. These tiny rebellions against his own deception felt like stepping stones across an abyss, each one bringing him closer to a revelation that terrified him more than any supernatural enemy he had ever faced. The following evening brought Victor's most dangerous gambit yet, an approach so bold and manipulative that it demonstrated both his desperation and his intimate knowledge of human psychology. Elena was adjusting Adrian's pillows when a man appeared in the doorway, well-dressed and elegant, carrying himself with the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He introduced himself as Vincent Thorne, claiming to be the long-lost brother of the patient she knew as John Doe, and his story unfolded with the polished perfection of someone who had rehearsed every detail. Victor's otherworldly charisma worked on Elena like a drug, his voice carrying undertones that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to emotional centers that wanted to believe his tale of family tragedy and desperate searching. He spoke of a brother who had disappeared 3 months ago after a head injury, how he had been searching hospitals across the country following leads and rumors, how he had finally traced his missing sibling to this room through a combination of persistence and luck that felt like divine intervention. Elena found herself drawn to his narrative despite instincts that screamed warnings she couldn't quite articulate. Victor wove details about Adrian's supposed past with the skill of a master manipulator, describing childhood memories and personality traits that felt authentic enough to be convincing while subtly undermining Elena's growing attachment. He suggested that his brother had always been troubled, prone to dangerous relationships and self-destructive behavior that had worried the family for years. He hinted that Elena might be in danger from forces she didn't understand, that her patient's condition might be connected to criminal activities or dangerous associates who would eventually come looking for him. The performance was flawless, designed to plant seeds of doubt while appearing to offer concerned family support. but Elena's intuition rebelled against Victor's presence with an intensity that surprised her. Something about his perfect composure, his too convenient arrival, his intimate knowledge of hospital procedures that suggested familiarity with medical environments, all combined to trigger warning signals she couldn't consciously explain. She found herself stepping protectively closer to Adrian's bed, positioning herself between the supposed brother and her patient in a gesture that revealed more about her true feelings than any conscious declaration. Victor's manipulation reached its peak when he placed a seemingly comforting hand on Elena's shoulder, his touch carrying supernatural compulsion that should have overwhelmed her human will and made her compliant to his suggestions. But at the moment of contact, Adrian's protective instincts overrode 8 centuries of self-control, and his eyes snapped open, silver irises blazing with supernatural fury that lasted only a heartbeat before he forced them closed again. Elena caught the movement in her peripheral vision and spun toward the bed, but Victor smoothly redirected her attention with suggestions that she had imagined the response, that grief and exhaustion were making her see signs of consciousness that weren't actually there. She accepted his explanation with conscious mind, while her subconscious filed the moment away as another piece of evidence that everything about this situation defied logical explanation. Victor departed with promises to return with proper documentation and legal authority to make decisions about his brother's care, but Adrian's vital signs remained elevated for hours after his departure, his supernatural senses still resonating with protective rage and the terrifying realization that his brother was escalating their conflict in ways that put Elena directly in harm's way. That night, after the hospital had settled into its deepest quiet, Elena discovered an antique locket on Adrian's bedside table that had definitely not been there when her shift began. The piece was exquisite, crafted from silver so old it had developed a patina that spoke of centuries rather than decades, and delicate engravings covered its surface in patterns that seemed to shift and move in the dim lighting. Elena opened it with trembling fingers and found herself staring at a miniature portrait that made her heart stop. The woman in the painting possessed Elena's exact features, from the shape of her eyes to the curve of her smile, but she wore the elaborate dress and hairstyle of a bygone era that suggested the portrait was far older than Elena's 28 years. The resemblance was so perfect, it felt like looking into a mirror that reflected not her present self, but some impossible ancestor or past incarnation that challenged everything she believed about coincidence and rational explanation. When Elena's finger traced the painted features, the locket seemed to pulse with warmth, and suddenly her consciousness filled with images that belonged to someone else's memory. She saw herself, but not herself, running through moonlit gardens in heavy skirts that rustled against stone pathways. She felt terror and desperate love, the particular anguish of someone trying to reach a beloved who was slipping away into darkness. Most clearly of all, she heard her own voice calling out a name that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. Adrian. The vision lasted only seconds before Elena jerked her hand away from the locket, but the emotional resonance lingered like the echo of a bell struck in an empty cathedral. She stared at Adrian's face with new recognition, searching his features for confirmation of connections that transcended logical explanation, while somewhere in the deepest chambers of her heart, she began to understand that their bond might be far older and more powerful than anything that could be explained by 3 months of bedside conversations and gentle care. The emergency alarm shattered the quiet of Elena's shift at 2:17 in the morning, its urgent wail cutting through the hospital corridors like a blade through silk as trauma teams mobilized for incoming casualties from a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate. Elena's supervisor found her at Adrian's bedside and delivered orders that felt like a physical blow. All available ICU staff were needed in the trauma bay immediately, no exceptions, no delays, and no time for the careful patient transitions Elena usually insisted upon. She looked down at Adrian's peaceful face, her heart clenching with irrational fear about leaving him alone. But professional duty overrode personal attachment as she squeezed his hand once and whispered a promise to return as soon as possible. What Elena could not know was that her departure would trigger a cascade of supernatural consequences that would shatter the careful balance Adrian had maintained for 3 months, revealing the true depth of connection that had formed between them. Within minutes of her leaving the ICU, Adrian's vital signs began fluctuating in patterns that defied medical explanation, his heart rate dropping to dangerous levels, while his blood pressure readings swung wildly between extremes that should have triggered immediate intervention. The automatic monitoring systems registered the changes, but attributed them to equipment malfunction rather than genuine patient distress, leaving Adrian to experience the terrifying realization that his supernatural healing abilities were somehow dependent on Elena's proximity. Without her presence, the careful equilibrium that had sustained his deception began crumbling like a dam with structural damage, each passing hour bringing him closer to a collapse that would expose not just his consciousness, but his true nature to anyone monitoring his condition. Dr. Marcus Holt arrived in the ICU at dawn to find John Doe's monitors painting an alarming picture of systematic organ failure, reading so dire that immediate intervention appeared to be the only option for saving the patient's life. Elena was still occupied in surgery with trauma victims, unreachable and unaware that her mysterious patient was dying in her absence, and Marcus seized the opportunity to implement the experimental neurological procedure he had been advocating for weeks. His motivation was a toxic mixture of medical curiosity and personal jealousy, a desire to prove that Elena's attachment to this patient was misguided while simultaneously positioning himself as the brilliant surgeon who had accomplished the impossible. As Marcus prepared his surgical equipment and assembled a small team of residents eager to assist with what promised to be a groundbreaking procedure, Adrian's supernatural senses picked up Elena's emotional distress from 3 floors away. She was losing a patient, a young mother whose injuries were too severe for even the most skilled surgical intervention, and her grief resonated through the hospital's walls like a bell struck with overwhelming force. The sound of Elena's muffled sobs, filtered through surgical masks and operating room doors, but crystal clear to his enhanced hearing, triggered something primal and protective in Adrian's vampire nature that overrode every instinct for self-preservation he had developed over 8 centuries of survival. His eyes snapped open with the force of supernatural fury, revealing silver irises that blazed with inhuman light as his true nature surged to the surface like a tsunami breaking through seawalls. The monitors around his bed erupted in electronic chaos as his vital signs spiked beyond anything the machines could measure, heart rate climbing past human survival parameters, while electrical systems throughout the ICU began failing in cascading power surges that sent sparks showering from overhead fixtures. Marcus stumbled backward from the bed as Adrian's supposedly comatose form convulsed with energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate with dangerous potential, his surgical instruments clattering to the floor as fear replaced medical curiosity in his rapidly paling face. Elena felt the disturbance 3 floors away, like a physical blow to her chest, abandoning her post-surgery documentation to run toward the ICU with her heart pounding and her mind filled with inexplicable certainty that Adrian was in mortal danger. She burst through the ICU doors just as Adrian's monitors flatlined completely, the sudden silence after hours of electronic alarms more terrifying than any sound she had ever heard. But before she could reach his bedside, the machines roared back to life with readings so impossible they seemed like science fiction rather than medical reality. In that moment of chaos and electronic resurrection, Elena's eyes met Adrian's fully conscious gaze across the small space of room 7, and the recognition that passed between them transcended every rational explanation she had constructed over the past 3 months. She saw intelligence that was ancient rather than human, power that belonged to legends rather than medical textbooks, and most shocking of all, She saw love that felt like recognition, rather than newly formed attachment. Adrian's silver eyes held hers with an intensity that should have terrified her, predator acknowledging prey in the most fundamental way possible. But Elena felt no fear as she moved toward his bed, with the steady purpose of someone finally understanding the truth about a situation that had never made sense. The supernatural awareness flowing between them carried information that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to instincts Elena didn't know she possessed, telling her that this man was dangerous and otherworldly and completely devoted to her protection in ways that violated every boundary between human and inhuman existence. Marcus fled the room with muttered excuses about consulting with other specialists, leaving Elena alone with a patient who was clearly no longer pretending to be unconscious and whose gaze followed her movements with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting centuries for this moment. The silence stretched between them like a bridge spanning impossible distances until Elena reached the bedside and placed her hand over his with the same gentle pressure she had used countless times before. But now the touch carried acknowledgement of truth rather than faith in imagination. Adrian's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries and the particular ache of someone who had been holding their breath for an impossibly long time before being given permission to breathe. Elena, he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a confession and a promise all woven together into syllables that made her heart stop and restart in a different rhythm. The sound of her name spoken by someone who had supposedly been comatose for 3 months should have sent her running for psychiatric evaluation or security assistance, but instead she felt the particular relief of someone whose intuition had finally been validated by external reality. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, and her voice carried more curiosity than fear as she settled into the chair beside his bed, with the determined composure of someone prepared to hear truths that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world. Adrian struggled to find words that could convey the complexity of his situation without revealing the full extent of his deception or the supernatural nature that made him more dangerous than any human she had ever encountered. "Since the beginning," he said finally, his silver eyes never leaving her face as he searched for signs of the terror that should have sent her fleeing from his presence. "I have been conscious since they brought me here, listening to every word you spoke, learning who you are through the stories you told when you thought no one could hear." The confession should have felt like betrayal, and part of Elena did feel the sting of manipulation and lies, but stronger than anger was the recognition that every instinct she had developed about his awareness had been completely accurate. She had known, on some level deeper than rational thought, that he was listening and responding and choosing to trust her with his vulnerability even while maintaining the deception that kept him safe from forces she was only beginning to understand. "I knew you could hear me," she said, and her voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone whose faith had been vindicated against all reasonable doubt. "I talked to you because I felt you listening, not because I hoped you might be listening. The difference matters more than you know." Adrian's expression shifted with emotions that seemed too complex for human features to contain, gratitude and guilt and longing mixing with something that looked like fear, but felt more like someone standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether jumping represented salvation or destruction. "There are things about me that you don't understand, Elena. Things that would change how you see me, how you see this connection between us. I am not entirely what I appear to be, and the danger that surrounds me is more real than anything you could imagine." Before Elena could respond to his cryptic warnings, Victor materialized in the doorway, like a nightmare gaining physical form, his elegant composure replaced by supernatural fury that made the air around him shimmer with otherworldly energy. The brothers' confrontation exploded into violence that shattered the careful boundaries between the supernatural world and mundane hospital reality. Medical equipment flying across the room as forces beyond human understanding collided in the small space of Room 7. Victor's true nature blazed forth without pretense or disguise, his eyes glowing with predatory hunger as he spoke of thrones and curses and family obligations that Elena didn't understand but recognized as deadly serious. Adrian rose from the hospital bed with fluid grace that defied 3 months of supposed unconsciousness, his own supernatural nature manifesting in ways that turned him from vulnerable patient into something that belonged to legends and nightmares rather than medical textbooks. Elena found herself caught between two beings whose power could destroy her without conscious effort. But instead of fleeing toward safety, she positioned herself protectively near Adrian with instincts that recognized him as ally rather than threat, despite the evidence of inhuman abilities that should have terrified her beyond rational thought. The brothers spoke in a language that predated any human civilization Elena knew, their words carrying the weight of ancient grievances and supernatural politics that had been brewing for centuries before her birth. But through the chaos and violence and otherworldly fury, she heard Adrian say her name again, like an anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep away everything she thought she understood about reality. Victor's laughter carried the particular cruelty of someone who had found his enemy's weakness and intended to exploit it with surgical precision. But Elena stood her ground beside Adrian's hospital bed and realized that whatever truths were about to be revealed, whatever dangers were about to unfold, she had already made her choice to trust the man who had listened to her secrets with the attention of someone who understood the value of human hearts, even if his own might not beat with entirely human rhythm. Victor's laughter echoed through the destroyed hospital room like shards of broken glass, his supernatural presence filling the space with an otherworldly chill that made Elena's breath visible in small puffs of vapor despite the building's climate control. "Brother, you have always been too sentimental for your own survival," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who had spent centuries perfecting the art of psychological torture. "Do you remember the curse I placed upon our bloodline after you chose that mortal woman over family loyalty? During the hours when the sun claims the sky, your power diminishes to barely above human levels, leaving you vulnerable as any ordinary man. For 8 centuries you have endured this weakness, searching for scientific solutions and magical remedies, when the answer has always been elegantly simple." Victor moved through the wreckage of medical equipment with predatory grace, his attention fixed on Elena, as if she were a chess piece whose value had suddenly become clear to all players in an ancient game. "The curse can only be broken by willing sacrifice," he continued, his words deliberate and cutting as surgical instruments. "Someone who loves you truly, knowing your nature fully, must give their life freely to restore your power. How poetic that you should find such a person while hiding in this monument to human fragility, playing the helpless patient while she poured out her heart to what she believed was an unconscious man." Elena felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her like ice water. But her gaze remained steady on Adrian's tortured expression as pieces of a supernatural puzzle fell into place with horrible clarity. His infiltration of the hospital had not been random circumstance, but calculated planning, a search for scientific alternatives to the very sacrifice his brother now demanded. The enzyme samples he had come to steal, the research laboratory he had never reached, all of it had been designed to avoid the moment that was now unfolding, with the inevitability of tragedy written in ancient scripts. Adrian's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries of guilt and the particular anguish of someone whose every choice had led to this impossible moment. "I came here seeking another way, Elena. I spent months researching biochemical solutions, genetic therapies, anything that might break Victor's curse without requiring the death of an innocent." "The irony is exquisite," Victor interjected, circling them like a predator savoring the final moments before striking. "You sought to avoid sacrifice through science, but science brought you the perfect sacrifice instead. This mortal woman has fallen in love with a fantasy, with the mysterious patient who listened to her secrets and made her feel less alone. She doesn't truly know what you are, brother. She has never seen you feed, never watched you kill, never understood that the man she believes herself to love is a creature who has ended thousands of human lives across the centuries. The accusation hit Elena like a physical blow, forcing her to confront truths about Adrian's nature that her rational mind had been avoiding, even as her heart had recognized something otherworldly in their connection. She looked into his silver eyes and saw confirmation of Victor's words, saw the weight of ancient guilt, and the particular sorrow of someone who had lived too long and done too much to ever be worthy of redemption through love. But stronger than horror was the recognition that every gentle touch, every moment of protective instinct, every sign of genuine care had been real, despite the predatory nature that lived beneath his human facade. Adrian turned to his brother with resignation that felt like watching someone choose execution over continued existence. I will not trade her life for my freedom, Victor. The curse can remain for all eternity before I would harm the only person who has shown me what it means to be worthy of love rather than fear. Keep your cure and your power. I choose Elena's life over everything else our kind has ever valued. Victor's expression shifted from amusement to fury as his carefully laid plans encountered unexpected resistance, his supernatural features becoming more pronounced as rage stripped away the veneer of civilized conversation. You would choose mortal weakness over the throne that is your birthright? You would condemn our entire bloodline to eventual extinction because one human woman made you feel less monstrous? Adrian's response carried the finality of someone who had found something worth dying for after centuries of merely existing. Yes, he said simply, and the word resonated through the room like a bell tolling the end of an age. Elena felt her heart break and soar simultaneously as she witnessed Adrian choose her over power, love over survival, humanity over the supernatural authority that had defined his existence for 8 centuries. But even as part of her celebrated his choice, another part rebelled against the sacrifice he was making, the way he was accepting defeat without exploring every possible alternative. She had spent her adult life solving medical puzzles that others deemed unsolvable, finding hope in situations where despair seemed like the only rational response. And she refused to believe that ancient curses were immune to creative solutions. While the brothers faced each other with supernatural tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm, Elena's mind raced through everything she had learned about vampire lore in her recent research. The historical cases she had studied, the patterns of disappearance and transformation, the accounts of willing sacrifice that appeared in multiple cultures across different continents and time periods, all pointed toward interpretations of sacrifice that went beyond simple death. In medical school, she had learned that successful treatment often required reframing the problem, looking at symptoms from new angles until previously invisible solutions became apparent. Sacrifice, she realized, didn't necessarily mean death, but rather the complete giving of oneself, the willing abandonment of one life in service of another. Victor had interpreted the curse requirements through the lens of his own cruelty, assuming that love must be destroyed to be proven. But Elena's nursing experience had taught her that love often required transformation rather than termination. I offer myself, she said, her voice cutting through the supernatural tension with the clarity of someone who had found certainty in the midst of chaos. Victor and Adrian both turned toward her with expressions of shock, but Elena continued with the steady conviction of someone who had discovered a truth worth defending with her life. The curse requires willing sacrifice from someone who loves truly and knows fully. I volunteer to be that sacrifice. Understanding completely what Adrian is and choosing to give myself to break the chains that bind him. Adrian's response was immediate and horrified, his supernatural composure cracking as he moved toward her with desperate urgency. Elena, no. You don't understand what you're offering. The transformation will cost you everything that makes you human, everything that makes you yourself. You'll become what I am, a creature of darkness and hunger that exists outside human society forever. But Elena had spent weeks falling in love not just with Adrian's hidden consciousness, but with his struggle to maintain some vestige of humanity despite his supernatural nature. And she understood that transformation didn't have to mean corruption if it was chosen from love rather than imposed through violence. "I'm not offering to die, Adrian. I'm offering to live differently, to become something new that can stand beside you without the vulnerabilities that make ordinary humans unsuitable companions for your kind." Victor's laughter returned, but now it carried undertones of uncertainty as his understanding of curse mechanics encountered interpretations he had never considered. "You think transformation constitutes sacrifice, little mortal? You believe becoming vampire kind represents giving of yourself rather than gaining power beyond your species' limitations." Elena met his gaze with the steady determination of someone who had found purpose beyond personal comfort. "I know that choosing to love someone completely means accepting the consequences of that choice, even when those consequences require becoming something I never imagined possible. I'm not seeking vampirism for power or immortality. I'm accepting it as the price of standing beside the person who showed me what real connection feels like." Adrian's internal struggle played out across his features like conflicting storms, love warring with protectiveness as he wrestled with the impossibility of accepting Elena's offer while simultaneously recognizing it as the only solution that might preserve both their lives. Before he could voice further protests, Victor forced the choice by revealing his true intentions with casual brutality. "The girl dies regardless, brother. If she will not serve as willing sacrifice to break your curse, then she dies as collateral damage in the supernatural war that will consume this pathetic mortal realm. I have grown tired of playing politics with vampire nobility who question my right to rule in your absence. Elena's death will serve as demonstration of what happens to those who harbor enemies of my reign." The threat crystallized everything into sharp focus for Elena, eliminating any remaining doubt about her decision, as she realized that choosing transformation with Adrian was choosing life and love over death and emptiness. She stepped toward Adrian with hands extended, offering herself not as victim, but as partner in whatever supernatural future awaited them. The connection between them, forged through weeks of emotional intimacy and strengthened by moments of supernatural recognition, resonated with power that neither Victor's curse nor his political machinations had anticipated. When Elena's fingers touched Adrian's, their bond exploded into supernatural awareness that transcended the simple mechanics Victor had built into his original curse. Elena's willing transformation began immediately, but instead of weakening Adrian as traditional sacrifice might have done, her choice to embrace vampirism while maintaining her essential humanity created something unprecedented in supernatural history. Her love, freely given with full knowledge of consequences, didn't break Victor's curse through death, but transformed it through connection that preserved the best aspects of both their natures while discarding the limitations that had made the curse effective. Adrian felt his daylight weakness disappearing not through Elena's destruction, but through her transformation into something that could amplify his power while maintaining the compassion and empathy that had drawn him to her in the first place. Elena experienced the change as expansion rather than loss, her supernatural senses awakening to perceive the world in ways that enhanced, rather than replaced, her human understanding of healing and connection. Victor's carefully constructed revenge crumbled as the curse mechanics bent around love that refused to conform to his understanding of sacrifice and power, creating instead a partnership between equals that strengthened both participants while undermining every assumption about vampire nature that had governed supernatural society for millennia. The ancient curse, designed to force choice between love and power, found itself obsolete in the face of love that chose transformation over destruction, creating something new that belonged fully to neither human nor vampire worlds while drawing strength from both. The hospital's emergency lockdown began at precisely midnight as Victor's supernatural influence infiltrated the building's security systems, sealing every exit and trapping staff and patients inside what would become the epicenter of Elena's transformation from human to something unprecedented in supernatural history. She felt the change beginning as a whisper of fire in her veins, starting from the point where Adrian's blood had mingled with hers during their desperate kiss moments before Victor's final assault, and spreading through her circulatory system like liquid starlight that rewrote her cellular structure with each heartbeat. The process should have taken days of agony and unconsciousness, the traditional vampire transformation that required death and rebirth in darkness. But Elena's emotional bond with Adrian accelerated everything beyond supernatural precedent, her consciousness remaining intact, while her body shed its human limitations like a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. Her senses exploded with awareness that transcended anything she had experienced as a mortal, her hearing expanding to catch conversations 3 floors below, the whispered prayers of terrified patients, the rapid heartbeats of medical staff trapped in supply closets, and most clearly of all, Adrian's thoughts brushing against her mind like gentle fingers exploring the landscape of her transformed consciousness. She could smell emotions now, fear and confusion, and desperate love mixing in the air around her like visible auras, and when she moved, her body responded with supernatural speed and strength that felt like dancing with gravity itself. The compassion that had defined her human existence remained intact, amplified rather than diminished by her new nature, creating something that had never existed before in vampire history, a bridge between human empathy and supernatural power that allowed her to heal rather than merely hunt. Dr. Marcus Holt found himself trapped in the ICU with several other staff members when the lockdown engaged, the electronic doors sealing with finality that suggested this was no routine security measure, and through the reinforced glass he watched Elena rise from Adrian's bedside with movements that defied human physiology. Her eyes blazed with silver light that matched Adrian's own supernatural gaze, but where his carried the weight of centuries, hers held the fierce protectiveness of someone discovering powers that could save rather than destroy. Marcus pressed himself against the wall as Elena moved through the ICU with impossible grace, her new awareness allowing her to sense which patients were in genuine distress and which were merely sleeping. Her transformed hands, somehow able to ease pain, with a touch that carried supernatural healing energy. She paused at the bedside of an elderly man whose heart was failing, her fingers glowing with soft radiance as she channeled energy that stabilized his arrhythmia and gave him peaceful rest for the first time in days. The medical equipment registered impossible readings that Marcus's scientific mind rejected, even as his eyes confirmed that Elena Santos, the woman he had known and loved and lost, had become something that transcended every boundary between possible and miraculous. The sound of shattering glass from the hospital's main entrance announced Victor's supernatural army beginning their invasion, creatures that belonged to nightmares and ancient legends pouring through broken windows and forcing Elena to choose between preserving the supernatural world's secrecy and protecting the innocent humans trapped inside the building. Without hesitation, she chose protection, her new abilities manifesting in ways that saved lives while revealing truths that would forever change how the medical staff understood the world around them. She moved between floors with supernatural speed, appearing wherever patients were in danger, her touch healing injuries that should have been fatal, while her presence somehow calmed the primal terror that supernatural creatures inspired in human consciousness. A group of shadow demons cornered 3 nurses in the pediatric ward, but Elena arrived like an avenging angel, her silver eyes blazing as she dispersed the creatures with energy that felt like concentrated starlight, then immediately turned to comfort the children whose cries had drawn her across impossible distances. Dr. Sarah Chen watched her best friend transform from dedicated nurse to supernatural guardian, Elena's movements carrying the particular grace of someone who had found their true calling, and despite the impossibility of everything she was witnessing, Sarah felt only gratitude that Elena had become something powerful enough to protect them all. The lockdown had created a contained battlefield where ancient supernatural conflicts played out among innocent humans, but Elena's unique nature allowed her to navigate both worlds with equal effectiveness, healing human patients while also extending compassion to supernatural beings who had been caught in Victor's manipulative web against their will. She found a group of young vampires huddled in the basement morgue, newly turned and terrified by Victor's forced conscription into his army. And instead of viewing them as enemies, Elena recognized them as victims who needed guidance rather than destruction. Her touch carried not just healing energy, but emotional comfort that transcended species boundaries, her retained humanity allowing her to offer these supernatural beings the acceptance and understanding they had lost when their human lives ended. Adrian felt Elena's transformation completing itself through their supernatural bond, her consciousness merging with his in ways that amplified both their individual powers and created something entirely new in vampire history. Together, they became more than the sum of their parts, their combined abilities creating a resonance that could heal both human illness and supernatural corruption. And Adrian realized that Elena's willing transformation had not just broken Victor's curse, but had created a new form of vampire that retained the best qualities of both human and supernatural existence. Her influence flowed through their bond, and somehow restored aspects of his own humanity that he had thought lost to centuries of predatory existence, her compassion tempering his ancient rage, while her strength amplified his protective instincts in ways that made him more than he had ever been alone. Victor's true plan revealed itself as supernatural barriers throughout the city began crumbling. His army not just invading the hospital, but using it as a focal point for breaking down the boundaries that had kept the supernatural world hidden from human awareness for millennia. The ancient vampire had never intended simply to claim Adrian's throne, but to create a new world order where supernatural beings ruled openly over human populations. And Elena's hospital had been chosen as ground zero because her transformation would provide the emotional energy necessary to shatter dimensional barriers that had protected humanity from supernatural predators for thousands of years. But Victor had miscalculated the nature of Elena's transformation and the unique bond she shared with Adrian, their combined power creating protective barriers rather than destructive ones, their love generating energy that strengthened rather than weakened the boundaries between worlds. Elena's intimate knowledge of every corridor and room in the hospital became crucial as she and Adrian worked together to contain the supernatural outbreak, her understanding of the building's layout, allowing them to create defensive positions, while her medical training helped her identify which humans needed immediate evacuation and which could shelter safely in reinforced areas. She moved through familiar halls that had become a supernatural battlefield, but instead of feeling like a stranger in her own workplace, Elena felt like she was finally becoming who she had always been meant to be, someone powerful enough to protect the people she cared about, while bridging the gap between worlds that had been kept apart by fear and misunderstanding. The battle forced Elena to embrace her vampire nature completely, using supernatural speed to outmaneuver creatures that had terrorized humans for centuries, her strength allowing her to physically confront threats, while her healer's instincts guided her to use minimum necessary force, seeking to disable and redirect rather than destroy wherever possible. She saved a surgical resident from a pack of werewolves by demonstrating that vampire authority could command their respect, then immediately used her healing abilities to treat the young doctor's injuries while explaining in calm professional tones that everything he was seeing was real but manageable if he remained calm and followed her instructions. Her unique transformation had created something unprecedented in supernatural history, A vampire who retained not just human memories, but human values. Someone who could function in both worlds without losing the essential qualities that made life worth protecting. Elena found herself healing supernatural beings who had been wounded in Victor's forced recruitment, her touch somehow able to ease the spiritual corruption that turned gentle creatures into mindless soldiers. And she began to understand that her role was not just to fight Victor's army, but to offer redemption to those who had been caught in conflicts they never chose. A group of Fey warriors, who had been magically compelled to attack the children's ward, broke free of their mental constraints when Elena's healing energy dissolved the spells binding them, and they immediately turned their considerable abilities to protecting the very humans they had been forced to threaten. Throughout the supernatural chaos, Elena maintained her identity as a healer first and warrior second, her medical knowledge translating seamlessly into her new existence as she discovered that vampire abilities could be used to diagnose illness through enhanced senses, to channel energy that promoted healing rather than harm, and to provide comfort to both human patients and supernatural beings who had forgotten what kindness felt like after centuries of supernatural politics and predatory survival. The staff members who witnessed her transformation saw not a monster, but an evolution of the compassionate nurse they had always known, someone who had gained the power necessary to protect the people she cared about while retaining the gentle heart that made her someone worth following into impossible circumstances. As dawn approached and Victor's assault reached its climax, Elena stood in the hospital's main lobby surrounded by humans and supernatural beings who had found safety under her protection, her silver eyes blazing with power that felt like concentrated starlight as she prepared to face the ancient vampire who had underestimated the transformative power of love that transcended every boundary between human and supernatural existence. The climactic battle between Adrian and Victor raged through the hospital's corridors like a supernatural storm, their centuries-old conflict finally reaching the crescendo that threatened not just their lives, but the careful balance between supernatural and human worlds that had been maintained for millennia. Elena watched from the main lobby as the brothers fought with powers that shattered reinforced glass and bent steel support beams, their fury creating devastation that would be impossible to explain to authorities once dawn brought the outside world's attention to the mysterious lockdown. Through her new supernatural senses, Elena could feel the terror radiating from human patients and staff trapped throughout the building, but more than fear, she sensed something deeper in Victor's attacks that spoke of pain rather than simple malevolence, a desperation that reminded her of patients who lashed out because they couldn't articulate their suffering. Her enhanced empathic abilities, awakened through her unique transformation, allowed her to perceive emotional currents that transcended the immediate violence, and what she discovered in Victor's supernatural aura made her heart ache with recognition rather than hatred. The ancient vampire's rage carried undertones of profound loneliness, a grief so deep it had crystallized into centuries of revenge, and Elena began to understand that his curse against Adrian had been motivated not by political ambition, but by the particular agony of someone who had watched love destroy the person he cared about most. As Elena moved through the battlefield, using her healing abilities to tend both human and supernatural wounded, fragments of Victor's memories began bleeding through the supernatural energy that filled the air, revealing glimpses of a past that explained everything about his obsession with breaking Adrian's capacity for love. Centuries ago, Victor had watched his brother fall desperately in love with a mortal woman whose beauty and compassion had made Adrian abandon his supernatural duties and royal obligations, choosing human connection over vampire authority in ways that eventually led to the woman's death at the hands of supernatural enemies who used Adrian's weakness against him. The woman in Victor's memories possessed Elena's exact features, the same gentle eyes and healing hands, the same voice that could comfort both human pain and supernatural anguish, and Elena realized with stunning clarity that her connection to Adrian transcended their current lifetime and reached back through centuries of destined encounters that defied rational explanation. Victor had cursed Adrian not out of political necessity, but from the twisted love of someone who couldn't bear to watch his brother suffer through the same cycle of love and loss repeatedly, preferring to ensure Adrian's isolation rather than risk witnessing his destruction again. The revelation changed everything about Elena's understanding of the conflict, transforming Victor from simple villain into a tragic figure whose capacity for love had been corrupted by centuries of watching the people he cared about choose paths that led to their destruction. Instead of joining the battle directly, Elena positioned herself between the fighting brothers and did something that Victor had never experienced in 8 centuries of supernatural existence. She offered him the same gentle acceptance she had shown to countless patients who needed healing more than judgment. "Victor," she said, and her voice carried the particular calm that had soothed terrified patients through medical crises. "You cursed Adrian because you loved him, because you couldn't bear to watch him love someone who would eventually leave him broken and alone. But love isn't something that can be prevented or controlled. It's something that must be experienced fully, even when it leads to pain, because connection is what makes existence meaningful, rather than simply endless." Her words penetrated Victor's supernatural fury like light through darkness, momentarily stopping his assault as he stared at Elena, with the particular confusion of someone hearing truth they had spent centuries avoiding. Elena stepped closer, her new supernatural abilities allowing her to project not just words, but emotional understanding directly into Victor's consciousness, sharing with him memories of her own experiences with loss and healing, showing him how love could transform rather than destroy when it was embraced without fear. "You have spent 800 years trying to protect Adrian from the pain you felt when you lost the capacity to love," she continued, her empathic abilities reaching deep into Victor's damaged psyche to touch wounds that had festered since his own transformation into vampire kind. "But isolation isn't protection, Victor. It's just another form of death, one that destroys the soul while leaving the body intact." Adrian stopped fighting as he witnessed something unprecedented in supernatural history. His brother's carefully constructed emotional armor cracking under the gentle persistence of someone who refused to see him as enemy rather than patient. Elena's unique nature allowed her to perceive the frightened, lonely creature that Victor had become after centuries of denying himself the connections that made existence tolerable, and her supernatural healing abilities extended beyond physical injuries to touch the spiritual corruption that had twisted his love into possessiveness and control. She showed Victor memories of genuine love and acceptance that he had forgotten. Moments from his human life when he had been capable of joy and tenderness before supernatural transformation had convinced him that such feelings were weakness rather than strength. The act of genuine compassion that Elena offered Victor accomplished something that 8 centuries of conflict had failed to achieve. It reminded him of who he had been before pain and fear had shaped him into something unrecognizable, and the recognition broke not just Adrian's curse, but Victor's own cycle of revenge and isolation. The ancient vampire collapsed to his knees as Elena's healing energy flowed through him, dissolving the spiritual barriers he had constructed to protect himself from further emotional injury. And for the first time since his transformation, Victor wept with the particular relief of someone whose burden had finally been lifted by another person's willingness to share the weight. Adrian moved to his brother's side with centuries of conflict dissolving into understanding as he realized that Victor's cruelty had been motivated by the same protective instincts that had driven Adrian to accept Elena's transformation rather than lose her to mortality. The brothers embraced in the ruins of the hospital lobby while Elena watched with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found her true calling, not just as healer of bodies, but as bridge between souls that had been separated by misunderstanding and fear. 3 months later, Elena stood in the specially designed medical facility that served as her new workplace, a private institution that provided care for both human and supernatural patients who needed treatment that conventional medicine could never provide. Her unique transformation had created abilities that allowed her to diagnose supernatural ailments through enhanced senses, while using her medical training to develop treatment protocols that bridged the gap between scientific knowledge and supernatural healing. She moved through rooms filled with patients that included humans suffering from supernatural encounters alongside vampire children struggling with bloodlust control, and fey beings whose connection to natural magic had been disrupted by urban environments. Her days were spent translating between worlds that had been kept artificially separate, helping supernatural beings understand human medical concepts while teaching human medical staff to recognize and treat conditions that existed beyond conventional pathology textbooks. Adrian governed his supernatural kingdom with Elena as his equal partner, but they chose to spend most of their time in the human world, protecting innocent people from supernatural threats, while maintaining the delicate balance that kept both realms safe from the chaos that would result from full revelation. Their love story had become legend in supernatural circles, proof that connection could transcend species boundaries and ancient curses when it was based on genuine understanding rather than possession or control, and young supernatural beings often sought them out for guidance about navigating relationships that crossed traditional boundaries. The hospital staff who had witnessed the supernatural battle had their memories gently altered by skilled supernatural healers, but Elena maintained her friendships with the colleagues who had been part of her human life, particularly Sarah Chen, who sensed that something fundamental had changed about her friend, but couldn't quite identify what felt different. Even Dr. Marcus Holt developed a grudging professional respect for Elena's work at the supernatural medical facility, his scientific mind intrigued by treatment methods that produced impossible results, even if he couldn't understand the theoretical framework that made them effective. Elena continued her practice of talking to patients who needed someone to listen, but now her conversations included supernatural beings who had been isolated by their nature for centuries, creatures who had forgotten what it felt like to be heard and understood by someone who saw them as individuals rather than threats or tools. Adrian often joined these bedside vigils, their bond allowing him to experience human emotional complexity through Elena's perspective, while she gained understanding of supernatural psychology through his centuries of experience. Together, they created something unprecedented in either world, a partnership that served healing rather than conquest, protection rather than dominance, understanding rather than fear. Elena's gift for listening and empathy had expanded beyond the human realm to encompass beings whose pain had been ignored by both supernatural and human societies, and she found profound satisfaction in using her enhanced abilities to bridge gaps that had existed since the beginning of recorded history. Their facility became a neutral ground where supernatural conflicts could be resolved through mediation rather than violence, where humans who had been traumatized by supernatural encounters could receive therapy that addressed both psychological and spiritual damage, and where young beings of all species could learn that their nature didn't have to define their destiny. Adrian discovered through Elena's influence that ruling could mean nurturing rather than commanding, that strength could be measured by the lives protected rather than enemies defeated, and that love could indeed transcend any curse or limitation when it was grounded in mutual respect and shared purpose. Their relationship had transformed not just themselves, but the fundamental dynamics between supernatural and human worlds, creating new possibilities for cooperation and understanding that neither realm had imagined possible. Elena's unique nature as a vampire who retained human empathy became the foundation for a new era of supernatural diplomacy, while Adrian's willingness to choose love over power demonstrated to other ancient beings that evolution was possible even after centuries of established patterns. As Elena sat beside the bed of a young werewolf struggling to control his transformation triggers, reading him the same romance novel she had once shared with an unconscious Adrian, She reflected on how her journey from lonely night shift nurse to supernatural healer had taught her that listening with genuine compassion could indeed change the world, one patient at a time, one heart at a time, one connection at a time, proving that love was not just the greatest healer, but the foundation for every bridge worth building between seemingly incompatible worlds.